Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual DragonCon Virtual Science Track. My name is Vaughn James. I am one of the Science Track volunteers, and I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us in these uncertain times for our COVID-19 panel, where we have an absolutely stellar group of experts here to talk about COVID-19 and to answer some of your most pressing questions. We would really like your participation in this panel, and so please feel free to ask questions. If you are going to ask a question that you would like to be addressed to our panel, one favor to ask of you. If you could please start your question with a big capital letter Q. That will help our chat moderators and other volunteers be able to parse out people's questions so then we can get them answered. While we won't have time to answer everybody's question, please ask and we will do what we can to get through people's concerns. So with that, I will now let our panel introduce themselves. Topher, if you wouldn't mind starting us off.
Sure, I'm Topher Hunter. I'm a biomedical engineer working for a large medical device manufacturer based in the US. My background is principally in infection control engineering products, so things like air filters and similar things that try to disrupt the bacterial infection cycle.
Great, thank you. Jen.
Hey, so I'm Jen Hardy. I have my PhD in genetics and molecular biology. My specialty is really in the area of all that sort of theoretical stuff. I currently work at a biotech company that works on making CAR T cell therapy for cancer. So I've got some immunology experience as well. So hopefully I'll be able to touch a little bit on virus aspect of things as well as the immunology aspects.
Great, thank you. Eric?
Hi, I'm Eric Hall, and I'm a research scientist working on COVID-19 diagnostic testing, specifically a version called droplet digital PCR. I've also been told to say that my opinions are my own and not that of my employer. And I have a PhD in physical chemistry, and I've worked in microfluidics, lab automation, and molecular biology for about 15 years.
Amber?
Hi, I'm Amber Charleville. I am a nurse at a large Midwest teaching hospital. My opinions are also my own. I come from a background, I've done bedside nursing, I've done several other things within nursing, and I most recently work in an emergency department in a hospital. So I'm talking about my perspective as a nurse.
Great. Thank you all very much. I figured that it would probably be a good idea to start at the very start. Can you all talk a little bit about what life was like, what you were doing, what you were thinking, what you were feeling when you realized that COVID-19 was really going to be a thing?
I'll go first. So I remember I was, my mother had called me because she was planning on going to vacation, and she was freaking out about COVID. And I was like, it's not a big deal, Mom. It's only in China right now. Like, you don't need to worry about it. Because at that point, that's what we knew and that's where we were. And then I remember when it first started breaking out in the States, and we all realized that we were going to have to do something about it. And overnight, we were getting emails from our employer, like canceling all meetings over 8 people, canceling all of our travel, no matter what it was for. At one point, we were even like forbidden from traveling abroad, like just personally. That if we did, we risked, So yeah, that's. And everything really, really rapidly changed, even down to what I started doing because I started working on contact tracing. So.
For myself, I was on a business trip in Santiago, Chile, actually launching one of our bacterial control products down there. And we were kind of watching the news and seeing as things really started to catch on fire in the States. And I flew back on the day that they closed the border. I actually was on the first flight that landed in Atlanta that morning, and it was really scary. There was a time when we were honestly worried that maybe the plane was going to get turned around and we weren't going to be allowed back in the country or something crazy like that.
And for me, so I live in the San Francisco Bay Area these days, although I am a Tuscaloosa, Alabama girl at heart. So roll Tide. But I've been keeping an eye on it from the beginning because the Bay Area has so many Asian Americans and is also basically one of the first airports that planes land at coming from China. So I figured we were going to blow up no matter what. It was just a matter of time. So we actually did end up being the first place in the country to go into lockdown. I remember that basically Google and Facebook both like on a Friday suddenly said, okay, no more coming into work. Everybody works from home. And all the rest of us sort of went, oh, I guess this is a big deal now. And my office started talking about how we were going to, start doing distancing at the office and wearing masks and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And then we had done all this work. We had this huge Monday morning meeting about how we were going to handle this. And at 1 p.m., the lockdown order came from the county officials. And basically, I just grabbed my stuff, sprinted to the grocery store to grab the last few things I hadn't been able to find, like pasta, and like ran home and locked my door because I was freaking out. And I sort of expected it would blow over in sort of like 2 months. Well, stay inside for 2 months and it'll be fine. And yeah, not so much. Here we all are.
Yeah, my experience is pretty similar to Jen because we both live in the Bay Area. And yeah, I remember first thinking, well, it's probably going to be just like the last run through of SARS. It hopefully won't migrate to this end of the world. And then it started showing up, and then you had 2 weeks where everyone was saying keep your distance, wash your hands all the time. And then the shelter in place orders came through in the Bay Area, and in the span of a day, it was business as usual at the office too. Everyone's working from home. Okay. And then on a weird personal note, I had started my current job about a month before the shelter in place hit, and I was working on non-invasive prenatal testing. And we get sent home, and there's about a week where I'm thinking, oh God, I'm going to be laid off because this is not an essential project. And then at the end of the week, our boss informed us that we were all working on COVID, developing our company's COVID diagnostic test. So, and then since then, my life has been pretty much all COVID all the time.
I think a lot of people's lives have been all COVID all the time. So I think that's fairly relatable. I'll go to an audience question. We've got a question from Matt Jarrett on Discord. I've heard people say it's a flu, it's a common cold, it's et cetera, et cetera. Is it actually similar to anything? What is it most similar to?
And so I was thinking about this, and I think the best answer is it's like pandemic flu plus. It's similar. It's got the fever. It's got the nasty lung involvement. It's got an overactive immune response like we saw with the 1918 Spanish flu. But it also has this whole other vascular aspect to it, which we've never seen before in any other virus, which is really throwing everybody for a loop. I don't know if Amber, you can talk about that at all.
Well, I can tell you that when we first started looking at the spread, and we would ask people questions, to determine if they, were infected or not. We were asking questions. We basically had it down to, do you have a cough and do you have a fever? And that's all we looked at. And then, the next week, what am I talking about? The next day came and it was, okay, it's if they don't have a fever, that's all right. Ask them if they have these other symptoms. And then there were more symptoms and then more symptoms. And so now when we screen people, we're asking, do they have a headache? Do they have a cough? Do they have shortness of breath? Do they have nausea, vomiting? Do they have loss of sense of taste, loss of sense of smell? All these rashes, these symptoms that we would never, ever have asked with the flu. and now we are. And so because we know that COVID presents differently than most things we've seen before.
Yeah, and I think that plays into how it's been able to sort of spread. It's one of the reasons why it spread so quickly and caught a lot of countries off guard, because it evades like the current ways that we have for screening for disease, because it is just significantly different.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is that when people come in, and we ask them the screening questions, the first thing they want to do is say, well, it's, yes, I have a headache, but it's not that. I have allergies, or I have chronic migraines. But we have to tell them, no, sorry, we're still gonna swab you. We're still gonna, treat you like you have it, because most people just don't know if they do.
Topher, Eric, with your background in diagnostics engineering, developing tests, what is it like developing a screening method, a testing method for something that's pretty new?
So it's interesting. So different companies have different methods for doing this. The first aspect of it is deciding especially if you develop, most of the tests are molecular biology tests, so they're almost all based off of some form of genetic amplification. So you have to decide what aspect of the genome, what portion of the genome to target. And some companies develop their own targets. Most companies, however, use the targets that were developed by the CDC, and that's what we did. So actually, the CDC ended up doing a lot of the work for us to begin with, and then it simply became a matter of quickly validating it using our current reagent set and equipment. And basically, the first round was just this very sort of rapid go through what the FDA requires, produce the data it needs for emergency use authorization, which made for a very hectic 6 weeks. And I was working weekends pretty much all the time. And then after that, it becomes a matter of, after you get that first approval, then sort of upgrading the test and seeing how it can be optimized, so that, and then you go through this whole process again to get the emergency use authorization amended for this upgraded use of the test.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of subtlety in these tests that most people probably don't realize. Like, okay, you're taking a nasal swab versus a deep bronchial swab, or a spit test. Like, that's a different. It's being technical. It's a different matrix. You've got a different chemistry, a different solution holding the sample that you're looking at. And that's going to influence. So like for a molecular test where you're looking at the genes that are being expressed, somehow you've got to take probably the human cell that you've harvested out of the sample. You've got to break it open, and you've got to fish out, I'm being very simplistic, but you've got to fish out the genetic material in order to now chemically compare that to your target sample. And doing that isolation, that lysis and all that prep and purification, the acidity of the solution can change how the chemistry is going to work. So there's a lot of refinement, and it's, as Eric said, it's not just a matter of having the right sequence and plugging it into an existing test. And the same goes for antibody tests. The chemistry can cause the proteins to fold in different ways, and now you've got to work all that out. So there's a lot of work that goes involved, and a lot of great scientists working on this.
And one thing to add is also that then there becomes, even after all this, there becomes essentially the business / industrial pipeline of the whole thing, where in addition to making sure like everything is manufactured on a very quick timescale correctly, you also start running into issues where, for example, like existing clinics and hospitals will already have equipment that is tied to a specific company's proprietary reagent set. So one thing that's actually interesting is there's so many tests that have been approved by the FDA, but most of them really aren't making a huge dent in the testing need because of either that specific company's ability to not scale up their manufacturing process, or large hospitals are just say, our equipment is made for like this specific pipeline. We can't use this test. And so you end up, even though there's all of these options, what's actually a viable option for the testing pipeline gets really shrunken down.
Amber, are you seeing a lot of those kinds of effects maybe as a hospitalist? Is that affecting testing in hospitals?
I'm trying to think if I can answer this question. I mean, I have an answer. I just don't know if I can answer. I would say for our particular hospital, no.
Okay.
I've heard from colleagues, that they do see a struggle in whether or not they're going to test somebody or retest somebody, because they're trying to be conscientious of how many testing supplies they're using per patient.
Okay.
So I can tell you that, but for us, no, it hasn't been a problem.
Okay. We've gotten a few questions from YouTube and Facebook that, Jen, I think might be in your vein. What do you think about the Brady-Kinnon hypothesis?
So I took a look at the Brady-Kinnon article that's been making the rounds earlier this week, and I actually think it's really promising. I think it explains a lot of things about this disease that have been very confusing going in. A lot of people have been talking about... Yeah. So a lot of people have been talking about how COVID-19 in some respects looks more like a vascular disease than a lung disease, even though what usually kills people is the lung involvement. And so bradykinin is actually a molecule that, when it's released in large quantities in your bloodstream, starts permeabilizing your blood vessels. It's actually like it does have a normal physiological function. Like sometimes that's a good thing. Like we give heart patients who have high blood pressure ACE inhibitors, which do exactly the same thing. So in some ways, it's looking like if this elevated bradykinin hypothesis is right, then SARS-CoV-2 is acting like an ACE inhibitor drug, just really, really strongly. So you can look at some of the side effects of ACE inhibitors and look at some of the symptoms of COVID-19, and there's a weird synergy there. So the basic thought is that the virus is coming in, it's locking onto those ACE2 receptors in the body. That's amping up bradykinin. That's increasing your permeability of your blood vessels. That's causing the weird rashes. It's causing the COVID toes. It's causing the neurological symptoms because the blood-brain barrier starts to get a little leaky. All sorts of things like that. And it also hurts the lungs because then you start getting more fluid going into the lungs because of those leaky blood vessels, and you start getting more immune cells getting into the lungs because of those leaky blood vessels. And then that just synergizes with cytokine storms and overactive immune responses, and it becomes this really nasty cycle in the lungs. So that's the working theory from that paper and that research, and I think it all hangs together fairly well. The nice thing about that is that we understand ACE inhibitor drugs pretty well. And there are some treatments on the market to help ameliorate the side effects of those. So people are really rapidly trying to pivot to say, hey, let's test these in COVID patients and see if it help.
To sort of go off of what Jen is saying, a lot of what she explained there explains a lot about those people that are in higher risk categories. The mechanism of the disease, if it does match up to that, it makes sense why somebody, would be at a higher risk more than normal, even just because, their disease process interacting with that process. Yeah, it just makes a lot of sense.
We have a mask question from Discord. As a healthcare worker wearing an N95 mask, is it still effective when the mask seal gets wet with sweat? Is it really truly safe to wear more than once?
Complex question.
Okay.
So for one thing, as the mask gets wet, whether it be at the seal or at any of the surfaces, obviously now it's no longer passing air as effectively. You get a smaller total area to be passing your air through. So you're going to eventually start to either be pushing air through that mask at a higher pressure and higher velocity, which could accelerate its breakdown, or it's just going to slowly start to become more difficult to breathe through. So, I think there's that aspect. Now, as far as is it more or less or same effective at actually being a barrier, I'd be more concerned about the fact that as you're sweating, you've got a nice geez, I keep hitting my mic. You got a nice moist area that's going to accumulate droplets from either if you're infected and you're respiring out infected droplets. Now they're going to accumulate in that wet area. So now when you take it off, you've got a higher risk of creating a fomite, it's called, a contaminated material that can carry infection to somebody else. But also now if you're breathing in air that's carrying infected particles, it's going to trap and accumulate on that wet surface. So yeah, I would, I guess a wet mask might be better than no mask. But it's going to be very complex, and it's going to vary with the situation a lot, and so it's really hard to answer definitively.
Okay.
One thing to tackle the part about reusing a mask, the reuse of an N95 mask largely depends on how much the filters have become clogged with material, so it'll affect your ability to breathe. And if the mask has become damaged in a way where air can now get through the filter or air can get through large gaps in the filter. Typically the instructions you see for how often you need to replace an N95 mask assume this is being used in like woodworking or something where there's just a high level of particulate matter. Since I live in the Bay Area, which is just on fire, like for example, I would actually say for myself personally, N95 masks lose their lifetime gets cut down, not because of COVID, but because of because of the smoke particulates eventually clogging into the mask. And so I'd say a healthcare worker, it's harder to say just because that environment is definitely different than just going around outside in a normal office building. So it probably varies by scenario, but I'd say it's definitely fine to reuse an N95 mask. And unfortunately, you basically have to gauge based on what you're doing and where you are. If the mask becomes clogged, you're going to be able to not only, if it becomes clogged, you're just going to have trouble breathing. So I would say if you start having problems breathing through the mask, then it's definitely time to replace it.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just flashing to times of wearing a mask myself at work, and an N95 mask and a surgical mask and a personal mask, and the guidance changing, throughout the every day on how often you have to change and what you need to wear. And at one point, I think they had us all in N95s at all times, and now we don't do that unless we have. Unless we know the person is positive, we're screening the person, or if we do some sort of aerosolizing procedure in the room, regardless of the person's status, just in case they have it and we don't know, because when you aerosolize, droplets, they become smaller, and you need that N95 protection. We collect ours, so someone else screens them to see if they can still be reused and sterilized and stuff. I don't know if the person who asked the question, if their hospital is doing that or not, and I can't really speak to that process in detail.
Why do those recommendations change?
Partly because the science changes.
Okay.
It's, we're constantly learning new bits of information. Yeah.
I think that's been a challenge for a lot of people during this, is why do they keep hearing new things every other week? And a lot of people right now are getting to watch science live, which doesn't usually happen. Normally we do all this behind closed doors, we figure it all out, and then we come out with a nice, pretty statement about what you should do. But because this is a novel disease, nobody had any idea what's going on. We're doing research in real time. So everybody's getting to see what normally happens on the inside, where a paper comes out and then somebody rebuts it and somebody says, well, what did you think about this? And someone says, your methods are crappy, like your statistics are bad. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. That's normal, but it's just not normally public. And so I just want to encourage everybody that because you're seeing this doesn't mean the scientists don't know what they're doing. This is our normal process. You just are normally sort of shielded from it because we normally wait until we have a more concrete conclusion before we share it with the public.
I see this a lot, as a nurse, one of our primary jobs is to take science and then teach it to people in a way that they understand and it is workable for their lives. And, people really, really struggle with things that change over time. Why did my doctor change this med? Why do I have to change the dose I'm taking? Why do I not need these meds anymore? And, what does that all mean? And what it means is that science never stops and medicine never stops, and we keep getting better. So that's usually how I explain it to people. Like every time you see a change, it's usually because we're getting better at what we're trying to do. And that's a good thing.
To follow up on some questions about masks from Discord, do you all have any thoughts on the Duke mask study that claims that some masks and materials are contributing to spread?
That wasn't a study on masks. That was a study on a neat method. And that unfortunately the lay press latched onto it and latched onto the wrong part of the paper. It's a really cool, so basically they were trying to look at how much aerosol gets passed through a given mask. And they came up with a really neat method that uses off-the-shelf parts, creates a very simple, cheap, fast test. So you could envision maybe putting that into Amber's hospital as a way for them to continually reevaluate a mask as it's deteriorating. Like, how's its aerosol performance? But it's a first pass at a cool technique. It was not an attempt to definitively test mask A versus B. So yeah, that's how science works. Unfortunately, the lay press gets it, and sometimes they go nuts with it.
Amber, what is the experience like as a hospitalist? You mentioned that you have been involved in things like contact tracing. What is that? What is it like?
Well, contact tracing is calling a lot of people and giving them the news that they have potentially been exposed to COVID-19, and then screening them for symptoms, and then walking them through the process of, okay, you're going to be quarantined for 2 weeks, and we want you to report every day on these list of symptoms. We want you to take your temperature every day, and kind of going from there. And if that person becomes positive, then we know as soon as possible. And then we can go out from there. Okay, who is in contact with this person in the 2 weeks prior to when they started showing symptoms. Although usually we can narrow it down even further than that, and kind of go from there. And that's kind of what that is, to try to minimize and catch that cycle before it continues to spread on and more people get infected from your original first person that came up positive. So that's contact tracing in a very simplistic way. As far as what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry. What it's like in the hospital, or
yeah.
Well, what it's like in the hospital is what it's like always been like in the hospital, I guess, but also nothing like that. We've done a fairly good job of going back to business as usual. There was a period there where we were very much not. I even was laid off for 3 weeks as a nurse, which I never in my life thought I would ever be laid off as a nurse when I went into this profession. Like, never. That was supposed to be one of the selling points, that I would never be laid off. But as we've gone through the summer, we've gotten closer and closer to our actual normal numbers of patients, normal amount of people coming into the emergency department. It's just that we're all in masks now. And keeping our distance. You see computers everywhere that one of the computers has a thing that says don't use for social distancing, so that we're all spread out, which is hilarious because we already didn't have enough workstations. So yeah, I mean, it's if you've ever been in a hospital, it's the same, only you don't know what anybody looks like anymore.
Yeah.
Has anyone been on the receiving end of a quarantine since you mentioned that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's that like?
So I've been going into work about, I would say 40% of the time, because I do work in a lab, and some of what I do can be done on a computer. It's analyzing data and writing reports, but a decent amount I have to physically be there. And I got an email from my office on like 8 p.m. on a Saturday saying, hey, guess what? You are one of our lucky winners who was exposed to a coworker who tested positive. We can't tell you who because of privacy rules, but you need to stay home for the next 2 weeks, and you can't come back to work until you test, until you get a test on day 14 or later showing that you're negative. And so I basically locked myself in the house for 2 weeks, had to figure out grocery delivery, which it turns out really doesn't work very well. They always screw something up. I had to get friends to try to help me take things to the post office. And of course was freaking out for about the first week about, oh God, am I about to come down with the plague? Fortunately, I didn't get sick. And after I sort of got through the initial first week, I was like, all right, I've hit the average amount of time. I'm probably okay. Now I'm just bored. And by the end, I actually felt pretty good coming out the other side of it. I'm like, okay, the worst happened. I had a 45-minute conversation with somebody who it turned out was positive for COVID-19, but we were both wearing masks. We were standing 10 feet apart the whole time, and it worked. So I'm actually less freaked out now, having gone through being exposed and getting quarantined, than I was before, which was not at all what I expected to happen.
Eric, how about you?
Yeah, so similar to Jen, I had a workplace exposure. I have to go into the office about basically 5 days a week. My work life has changed very little during shelter in place. So it's probably not surprising that I eventually got hit with an exposure risk. But like Jen said, I never showed symptoms. I tested negative, even though there is an issue with false negatives, and I may have been positive. Never showed symptoms, and all of my friends that I had been in contact with over 2 weeks, I contacted them, they got tested, they all tested negative. So definitely everyone at my work wearing masks, and me and my friends wearing masks definitely helped stop the chain of transmission. So masks work, they're great. Yeah.
I will say, sending out the email to all my friends and family who I'd recently been in contact with, it's a little bit like sending out the STD email to all of your romantic partners. There's a little bit of that shame where you're like, guys, so just so you know. So that was definitely an interesting moment.
On a side note, there is definitely as a sexually active gay man, there's definitely been a very high similarity between the way I have to think about interacting with my friends with COVID and the way I've had to think about sexual activity with particularly all STDs, but particularly HIV. And even though the types of risks are different, the way you think about harm reduction and risk reduction and what are you comfortable with, what is very low probability risk behavior versus high probability risk behavior, and to try to live a life that is as fulfilling as possible, there's a lot of similarities in that.
I've got two things to add to that. Number one, in contact tracing, if the person who is positive is wearing a mask, it almost always immediately stops the process right there, because we can say, okay, they were wearing a mask. It drastically drops the probability that anyone they were around when they were wearing that mask is going to get sick. So we don't even have to. Where the last time I was doing it, because I haven't been doing contact tracing for a little bit, but the last time I was doing it, we would stop it right there and we wouldn't even quarantine that person. We would tell them to self-monitor, but we would not quarantine them because their only exposure had been to somebody in a mask. So, and then number two, I think that there are some further correlations to the way that the governments handled HIV, in that they very much saw it as a disease that gay men had. And so they were less concerned about it. And, when we first saw our lackluster response, there was at least the urgency of, okay, we're going to shut down everything and everybody's going to go home. But as we have progressed, and it is the communities of color that are disproportionately being harmed by this disease, and our government is now pushing us to go back to work even more. I just think that's an interesting correlation of what they care about.
On a quick aside, in case people are interested, I don't know how many people have heard about the Sawbones podcast with Justin and Sydney McElroy, but it's a very entertaining podcast that has a lot of cool information about medical history. And about a couple of months ago, they did an episode where half of it was on Dr. Anthony Fauci, and part of it concerns when organizations like ACT UP in the 80s protested him to allow for the use of trial and experimental drugs to combat HIV. And from that is actually where the FDA's current emergency use authorization guidelines come from. So the history of HIV and queer medicine is really closely tied to what actually we're going through right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Fauci was actually the FDA director at the time.
Yeah, he's been doing this for a really long time.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that there are societal and cultural aspects to these things that have far-reaching consequences beyond merely the biological incidence of disease. Eric, you mentioned issues with false negatives. We have a question about that actually from Facebook with what is the rate of false negatives? What does that mean? What's a false negative?
All right. So there's several things that need to be answered to that question, because that's actually a really complex question. And the simple answer is that there's no simple answer to this. So first off, what a false negative is when a diagnostic test reports a negative result when you're really positive. So for COVID-19, you actually have been infected by the disease, but the test says that you're not. And a lot of people are probably familiar with this because this has been in the headlines for most of the outbreak. And so the first thing I want to talk about is kind of why this can happen. So when we validate these tests, we actually have to demonstrate first what their limit of detection is. And the limit of detection is essentially the concentration of viral particles where the instrument or the testing method will report the correct positive result 95% of the time. And then so that first we have to report that number. And you'll see, so different tests all have a different limit of detection associated with them. And a lot of these tests are actually very sensitive. They can detect hundreds, even tens of copies per milliliter of sample volume. However, and then on top of that, we have to demonstrate to the FDA that if we have a bunch of real clinical samples that have been shown to be positive, like by a different method, if we take the set that fall in their concentration of 1 to 2 times the limit of detection, and the test has to be correct more than 95% of the time for positive and also negative results. And we call this sensitivity for the positive ones and specificity for the negative ones. Now, if we have all these requirements in place, why do we have a false negative problem? The issue is that once these tests go out into the field, as has been talked about before, this disease is very weird. And one of the issues we have is that it has this exceptionally long incubation time prior to when you start showing symptoms. On top of that, when you get these tests, we take them out of essentially your nasal cavity, either the nasal or nasal pharyngeal, where it feels like a Q-tip is being jammed into your brain. And the problem is, though, the disease largely sits in your respiratory system. So there's basically there's a number of factors that mean that even though when we look at samples that are known to be positive, these tests are highly accurate, I think we're still in this phase of trying to figure out when is the right time to administer this test, what is even the right sample type to administer this test to get much more accurate results on the population. And as Jen talked to earlier, this is because we're doing science in real time. And one thing that I think it's really easy to forget is that COVID-19 probably represents like a completely unprecedented global scientific effort. Like the amount that we've learned about this disease and the tools that we've developed to fight it in the span of, I know it feels like 2020 is like 10 years, but it's only been 6 or 7 months. The amount that, like, let's say 8 months, like, because we don't want to limit to the United States exposure, so 8 months, 8 to 9 months. That's a crazy, like, any disease that we have fought previously, like, we don't have to do it on this time scale. Like, we have much more, like, tests usually take years to validate and develop so that they're much more accurate. But these tests like, it's called an emergency use authorization for a reason. We basically have skipped a bunch of the stuff so that we can get this stuff out there because something is much better than nothing. Sorry, and I hope that didn't ramble.
Yeah, I just want to stress that doesn't mean you can't trust it. Like
Yes.
You can still trust it. It just means that sometimes you are going to see those, false negatives or false positives, even sometimes. But you also have to take into consideration that we are training a lot of people to give these tests that we've never, like, that usually, in my entire nursing career, I think I did one flu swab for someone. And that was, I had to put it up their nose and go, and that was fine. But, when you're talking about this, and we have to train all these nurses to do it again and again and again and again, you're gonna see there's gonna be some level of human error there as well, because they have to get it in the right spot. And by the way, I have had 3 COVID tests because I had really bad allergies this year, and they kept sending me to get tested. So they have to get it way up there, and it is not fun, but it's bearable. Don't let that let you avoid getting tested. It's fine. It's just not pleasant if you've done it 3 times.
On that sort of idea, actually, Topher, is that an engineering issue then? Is that part of the problem with testing, or an issue with the testing?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is an engineering aspect. Even things like, do I use a cotton swab versus a polyester swab can change because polyester is more hydrophobic. It doesn't absorb water as well. So, that's going to change what sample you get out of the nasal passages. And you have to test and evaluate all that. And it takes time. And interesting, the Food and Drug Administration is in the business of weighing risk and benefit and trying to optimize that balance at all times for these products. And so sometimes they are, making the call that, okay, the data is not as great as we would like it. We normally wouldn't authorize this product quite yet, but we really, really need it. So we're going to use the emergency use authorization powers and get it out there in the market. And then that's why occasionally you see products that are, there was a rash of the early tests that all had to get withdrawn from the market because, oops, they didn't work as well as we thought. And it's balancing risk and reward, and they're doing their best.
I have a question from YouTube. What do you all think we'll see first, an effective therapy or an effective vaccine?
I think the only way we get out of this is with a vaccine.
Okay.
I've been doing a fair amount of reading into the various therapies that are coming out. Mostly what we've found so far are drugs that mitigate the worst symptoms in the very sickest people. So it's people that are on ventilators and are having a really extreme immune reaction and lots of things are shutting down. We've found some things that can help there, like steroids and remdesivir and dexamethasone. Those are all things that act on the people that are super, super sick and whose immune systems are now doing most of the damage, not the virus. But as for things that actually stop the virus early on, I haven't even heard a hint of anything that's doing a good job there. So in my opinion, basically looking at the literature, we are much closer to a vaccine than we are to an early stage antiviral.
I think that kind of goes hand in hand with another question that was asked regarding, what are the risks of herd immunity, or will we see herd immunity before we see a vaccine? Because if we can't develop a treatment that stops it very quickly, we have to have a vaccine, because otherwise we've seen people, we're now seeing that, sometimes people can get sick again in rare cases. And so we don't know yet how long people maintain their antibodies to begin with. So for this disease. So herd immunity is way too big of a risk and a question when we don't have a treatment that can shut it down at the beginning. So
what is herd immunity?
It's where a certain number of people in the population have immunity, and so it keeps it from circulating broadly within the population.
Yeah, I think the numbers quoted are usually at least 70% of the people have to be immune. And I know Sweden actually tried this as a strategy. They're like, we're not going to do lockdown. We're going to just go for herd immunity and hope enough people get it. And it hasn't really worked. So they just don't have a high enough percentage of the population that have been infected so far. So we had a trial in the wild of what happens if we all just try to get the virus. It turns out, well, it doesn't spread efficiently enough for that. So we really are banking on a vaccine at this point, but we're getting much closer on the vaccines. We've got several that are in phase 3 trials. They're spooling up manufacture already. What I've heard from Dr. Fauci is basically they're expecting early, like January 2021, is when we might start seeing them roll out. So I would say, pessimistically, that like summer next year, we'll definitely have a vaccine. So sometime in the first 6 months of next year, we're going to start seeing these roll out and hit the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely dependent on a vaccine at this point, unless, like Jen said, we find a treatment that can effectively knock out the disease process at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to continually emphasize the fact that herd immunity, while it's a neat scientific concept and sometimes it works in this disease, herd immunity hinges on a lot of dead people.
Yeah,
that should never be considered an acceptable path.
Yeah, the United States has 350 million people. So a 1% death rate is 3.5 million dead. Yeah. Not acceptable.
Yeah.
Jen, you had mentioned the fact that there were several vaccine candidates in stage 3 clinical trials. What does that mean?
So typically, this is an atypical year, but typically when you're developing something like this, the FDA makes you go through 3 phases. Phase 1 is just safety. It doesn't even look if it works. It just says, is this safe to give to people? Yes or no. And it's usually a really small number of people, like a dozen. And they're also look a little bit at dosing, like how big of a dose can you give before somebody gets side effects that are too bad. So, and then phase 2, they're like, okay, it's safe. Now let's prove that it works. And that expands to a larger group of people. And they test to see, okay, does our product do what we think our product does? Mm-hmm. If it passes phase 2, then you expand to phase 3, which you start opening it up to hundreds of people where you test it in a really broad group because you're trying to catch the little, 1% side effects and things like that so that you can put them on the label and the list of, you may get all this weird stuff, but it doesn't usually happen to people. So in a typical progression, you go very methodically from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. not this year. What a lot has been happening to speed this up is they compressed phase 1 and phase 2 for a lot of these vaccines. So like, we're going to test safety and we're going to test efficacy at the same time, get through it real quick. Okay, and if it shows that it works and it's safe, then we immediately go to testing a huge number of people and we start manufacturing it at the same time, because just in case it passes phase 3, we already want to have a warehouse of the stuff. So that's what's going on with most of these vaccines right now.
A good general rule of thumb for drug, again, in a typical year for drug research and development is 10%. So at every one of those phase 1, 2, and 3, approximately 10% of drugs will actually pass to the next phase. So to get a successful product out the end, you normally have to introduce 1,000 different drugs into the system to get it through. This is not a normal year, so hopefully we can do a lot better than that.
Mm-hmm.
So where is it that you all think that we go from here? What do we do? What are we heading towards? Is there anything interesting on the horizon that you all see?
That's a hard one. I think we're all sitting here thinking about all the things we're missing out on, like Dragon Con, and all the things that we can't do that we wish we could. But fundamentally, I think the way out of this is to basically keep doing what we're doing. Stay home, be safe, wear your mask, small gatherings, outside, all that kind of stuff. And eventually a vaccine will come online. They'll figure out a way to distribute it to the vulnerable people in the population, which, boy, I'm glad I'm not on that committee because that sounds complicated. Mm-hmm. And sort of slowly life will reboot back to normal. But I feel like I'm sort of treading water until then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're in for essentially a logistical kind of a mess with regard to the distribution of the vaccines. On the one hand, I believe they've actually started production of all 3 in the Operation Warp Speed program, so that they'll have them for when they're approved. But on the other hand, it's likely there's been some talk that it's likely any vaccine will require at least 2 shots. So the tracking who's had 1 and who's had 2 is probably going to be very difficult, particularly given if someone is how someone is getting or not getting their health care, unfortunately. So I think, unfortunately, we're probably also going to go through probably a year where people will be in varying stages of vaccinated and depending on what the immune response is from the vaccine, varying stages of immune response. And on top of that, I think is going to result in just, I think, kind of a general confusion about who and what they're in. Like me personally, I'm planning on essentially wearing a mask all the time through 2021 because I think even if I were to be, I'm planning to get vaccinated. So even after I get the vaccine and I have an acceptable immune response where hopefully even if I got it, it would be a mild to difficult cold. You still want to maintain mask culture because you don't know who's been vaccinated. You don't want that to turn into a whole argument again. Oh, well, I don't need to wear a mask. I'm vaccinated. It's well, even then you should probably wear it.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Amber.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I'm kind of thinking through my head, the mass efforts that we already do for fall flu vaccinations and what that looks like. And then also thinking about other diseases that take multiple steps to vaccinate against. And even the fact that sometimes you end up needing booster shots and then so forth to boost your immune response later on down the road. So it's not as if we don't have a precedent for some of these things in different categories. It's more that we don't have a precedent where they're all combined into one. And so I think that is going to be interesting for how we go about getting everyone vaccinated. But I am looking forward to when we are all vaccinated and I can go and do all the things that I want to do.
Yeah, I think on the days when I'm trying to pull myself out of the the 2020 induced funk, I like to try to think about some of the interesting knock-on effects that we've observed. Whether it be like the rate of car accidents plummeted because nobody was driving, or local pollution sources falling off. And maybe as has been alluded to, maybe we'll see some improvement in the flu season because hand hygiene and mask culture is more predominant. It's really truly is going to be a new world, and there's going to be a lot of interesting, both good and bad things that come out of it, and it's going to be an interesting time. And watching the world happen, I keep joking with my friends, like I always enjoyed reading history. I never quite wanted to live through it, but here we are.
Yeah, that's definitely been, I think, one of the more interesting aspects is just knowing that this is fairly unprecedented. And people, at work, they keep saying, well, we've never seen it, we're living through unprecedented times, right? Like that should be like that's your reward. We're living through an unprecedented. What? That is not an acceptable reward to me.
There is a curse. It says, "May you live in interesting times."
Mm-hmm. The one that's going to be really interesting to me is actually on the non-science side, is how is this going to affect work culture when we start going back to work? We've had so many de facto experiments in how many people can actually do their jobs from home. How many of those people are actually going to end up back in the office when all this is said and done? That's going to be really interesting to watch that play out.
I know that we got an unprecedented number of people home and successfully working from home very, very quickly. And then I know that we are, in fact, setting up to continue that indefinitely now, even though, we're hopeful for a vaccine, by mid-year next year, being widely distributed. We're still saying even past that, we're going to keep people at home if they're successful, because why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
As we reach the end of our time, then I will go with one last question that's sort of based on that. Do you think that our behavior has been fundamentally changed by this?
I was just talking with my friends as to whether we're going to have an entire generation of people who become agoraphobic, because now we've been trained to be afraid of crowds and like crowded spaces and getting too close to people. I feel like I'm going to have to go through this retraining period of not jumping back if someone's closer than 6 feet to me.
Yeah, I don't know that as a society, certainly in the States, I don't know that we've learned. I think some subsets have learned and changed, but we'll see.
I'm not super hopeful on mask culture continuing on past COVID. I don't think it's going to happen with as resistant as we were to a literal global pandemic, making us all wear a mask. If that wasn't enough for us to be like, yeah, sure, that's reasonable. I don't see it happening past COVID.
Well, with that, because we have just a few minutes left, I would like to take the time to thank you all. Amber, Jen, Topher, Eric, this has been phenomenal. This has been, I think, very informative. Thanks for taking the time to be here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts that you all would like to share about COVID-19 and the world, what we live in?
Wear a mask. It does work.
Yeah. Wear a mask.
And do your best to stay sane. There are low risk things you can do to still have a life. So I would say, like Eric was saying, there's a balance to be struck between perfect safety and doing things that are relatively safe and will keep you from absolutely going bonkers.
Yeah, there's with a lot of forethought, you can, I'd say, like, maintain a life that's like 80 to 90% of normal.
Yep. Find those things that are going to keep you happy and sane, because it's a unique time. And remember, we're all here in it together.
I always hear that song from High School Musical every time somebody says that. We're all in this together. Yeah.
Boy, we wish we weren't.
And with that to take us out, then we will say goodbye for now. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone that has been watching and commenting, for joining us. We hope that you have enjoyed it, and please enjoy the rest of Virtual DragonCon.